Good morning, students. Today I am going to take up Chapter 2, The Address, from the textbook Snapshots. It is written by Marga Minko. Let me give you a brief introduction about the author Marga Minko. Marga Minko is the pen name of Sarah Minko. That means her real name is Sarah Minko. In 1942, her parents were forced to move into the city's Jewish quarter. That is the time when World War II started. Her parents, brother, and sister were all deported, and Marga managed to survive the war in hiding. Thus, her stories often revolve around the existential problems often faced by the survivors of Second World War. The title of the story, The Address, speaks about its significance because the whole story revolves around the address number 46 Marconi Street. The story is all about the human predicament that follows the pre war and post war period. Here, predicament means the sufferings and pains experienced by the people. The story narrates how a daughter goes to her native place in Holland in search of her mother's belongings after the war. The theme of the story is human predicament and setting is Holland. The protagonist of the story is the girl who is the daughter of Mrs. S. The characters of the story are the narrator, Marga Minko, Mrs. S., mother of the narrator, Mrs. Dorling, an acquaintance of the narrator's mother, a girl of 15 who is the daughter of Mrs. Dorling. Now let's discuss the background of the story. The circumstances in Holland during the Second World War were unfavorable for Jewish people because during the German Nazi occupation of the Netherlands, 70% of the Jewish population was killed during the Holocaust. Holocaust means large scale destruction at mass level caused by nuclear weapon or fire. In the story, it is shown Mrs. S was Jews and was a rich lady, whereas Mrs. Darling was a non-Jews. And the girl, means the daughter of Mrs. S, was the survivor of Holocaust. And she had lost her house and her mother during the war. And after the war, after some time, this girl decided to go back to Mrs. Darling to take her mother's possessions. Let's begin the story now. The first scene starts with the girl goes to the address number 46 Marconi Street. That is Mrs. Darling's house. And after ringing the doorbell, she was given a cold reception by Mrs. Darling because she took much time to recognize this girl. As Mrs. Darling had thought everyone in her house, everyone in her family was dead, and she also asked her if anyone else had come along with her. Insomuch, Mrs. Darling refused to let this girl enter her house and told her to come back sometime later. Now, this girl recognized while having a conversation with Mrs. Darling, this girl recognized her mother's green cardigan which Mrs. Darling was wearing. She decided to go back to the train station and thought about her mother and how she told her about Mrs. Darling, who was an acquaintance of hers. And during the war, Mrs. Darling would visit their house and take their possessions with her as she did not want them to get lost if they ever left the place. And after recognizing her mother's green cardigan, it was confirmed that the girl had come to the right house or the right address. The girl looked at the number plate again. It said number 46 and Darling was written on the plate on white enamel. As she was going back to the station, she was thinking about her mother who gave her this address. It was the first half of the war. Now she was just going back into the memories of the past. She was home for a few days and suddenly it struck her that the room was different now because various things were missing. And it was then her mother told her about Mrs. Darling. And she told her daughter that she was an old contact of hers whom she had not seen for years. Suddenly she came to visit her and since then they had been in regular contact. Her mother also told her that whenever Mrs. Darling came to visit her, she took something from the house with her, like table silvers, antique plates, even a vase. And Mrs. Darling's reason behind doing all this was if the family had to leave the place someday, then they would lose all their precious things. So, according to Mrs. Darling, in some or the other way, she was helping them. The girl reached the station without noticing any details on the way. She passed the familiar things after the war for the first time. She didn't want to upset herself with the familiar sights of houses and streets that reminded her of all the precious times. Back in time, this girl saw Mrs. Darling in person a day after her mother told her about this lady. She woke up late that morning and she was going downstairs when she saw Mrs. Darling, the lady with broad back, carrying a heavy suitcase, and she was going out of their house. And at that time, her mother introduced Mrs. Darling to the narrator. The narrator had a fleeting glimpse of Mrs. Darling's face. She asked her mother whether the woman lived far away. At that time, the narrator's mother told about the address number 46 Marconi Street. After many days after the war, the narrator was curious to take record of the possessions that must still be at number 46 Marconi Street. With this intention, she went to the given address. Gradually, the things were getting normal in the narrator's life. But one day she got curious about all the things that were still at that address. She wanted to see them and touch them. After the first hopeless visit, she decided to try one more time. And when she reached Mrs. Darling's house, a girl of 15 years opened the door. Now, the narrator asked her about her mother, and she told her that her mother had gone somewhere for some errand. Errand means when you go out to collect something. So the narrator decided to wait for her. Suddenly, the narrator noticed a Hanukkah candle holder hung next to a mirror, and she remembered that she never used it as it was unmanageable. The girl asked her to sit down as she opened the door for the living room. She stopped and she was disturbed. Means the narrator was disturbed because she was standing in a room which she knew and she did not. She was lost, means she was standing in the middle of the things which she did not want to see, and they burdened her. Maybe because of the way things were arranged, or the humid smell in the room, or the ugly furniture. She was scared to look at everything. She sat down on a chair and she looked at the woolen tablecloth. She rubbed it and felt warm. The girl told her that her mother would be back soon and asked if she would like to have a cup of tea. The narrator answered, "Thank you." The narrator looked at all the familiar things, all the belongings in that living room. She looked at silver cutlery, she looked at the box, but now she could not feel any kind of connection with those things for which she had come. She had no courage to look around now, but she no longer had desire to possess them. So instantly she got up and walked to the door and left the room. When she reached the corner of the road, she looked at the nameplate again. The same address, number 46 Marconi Street. The address was correct, but now she did not want to remember it anymore. Why? Because now the narrator didn't want to go back, as the things in there reminded her of memories linked with the familiar life of old times. Because according to her, such things lose their value when you are separated from them and you see them again in a strange environment. So she finally resolved on forgetting the address as it would be easiest. And after that, she moved on. Here the story ends. To sum up, we can say the narrator was afraid to visit the place again, as it brought back many past memories. And when she saw all the possessions, they were arranged in a tasteless manner and she lost interest in them. She could not connect with the things and thought that she would not stay at the house any longer. She would destroy the good memories she had with those things. She finally decided to forget the address and moved on. And if we talk about Mrs. Darling, it is shown that she was a kind of woman who did not have any human emotions. So, what does it tell? It tells us that war leaves the world desolated and it cannot be healed.